9 Strangest Unsolved Mysteries from the early 1900s. Although most murders are solved relatively quickly, a mysterious few are forever out of reach of the authorities, and those who seek justice. While each of these cases could fill volumes in their own right, and some already have, here are 9 times that people literally got away with murder in the early 1900s. 1. The mysterious murder of 15-year-old Nora Fuller, 1902. On January 8, 1902, a man who gave his name as C.B. Hawkins leased an empty house on San Francisco's Sutter Street. He paid a month's rent in advance. He then visited a furniture store, where he bought just enough to temporarily furnish one room. He had an odd demand: his purchases had to be delivered that very night, or the deal was off. The store owner was surprised, and not terribly pleased, by these terms, but not wanting to lose the sale, he agreed. The next day, Hawkins went to another establishment, purchasing a second-hand bed and a cheap chair. He had the furniture arranged in a small room in the back of his new home's second story, leaving the rest of the house empty. Everything was ready. On January 10, a 15-year-old girl named Eleanor Nora Fuller answered a job advertisement she found in the San Francisco Chronicle: young girl to take care of baby, good home and good wages. The next day, she received a postcard from the man who placed the ad, who gave his name as John Bennett. He asked her to meet him at a local restaurant at either 1 or 6 o'clock that day. At 5, Fuller left her home to meet her new employer. An hour later, she phoned home to say that she was at Bennett's residence at 1500 Geary Street, and he wanted her to start work immediately. Mrs. Fuller told her to come home; she could begin her job on Monday. The girl agreed. That was the last her mother, or anyone else, ever heard from Nora Fuller. For reasons unknown to us, Mrs. Fuller waited an entire week to tell the police her daughter had disappeared. Perhaps she would have gone to them sooner had she known what Nora herself must have realized by the time she phoned. 1500 Geary Street was a vacant lot. The proprietor of a local eatery called the Popular Restaurant later recalled that at 5:30 on the evening Nora disappeared. A man who had frequented the establishment for many years, known to him only as Tenderloin because that was all this customer ever ate, told him that a young girl was on her way there, and could the proprietor send her to his table when she arrived? Tenderloin waited with visible impatience for about half an hour, then finally went outside where he presumably met her. That was the last time he had been seen at the restaurant. Fuller's disappearance remained a mystery for a month, until the lease expired on the home C.B. Hawkins had rented. On February 8, an inspector for the real estate brokers who owned the house came by to make sure it was in shape for new residents. It all looked quite in order until he looked into the small room on the second floor. On the second-hand bed Hawkins had purchased was the naked body of a dead young woman. She had been raped, strangled, and frightfully mutilated. Nora Fuller had finally been found. It did not take the police long to establish that the man who rented the house, the man who placed the babysitting ad, and Tenderloin must have been one and the same. The question is, who was he? A search of the room where the girl was killed was fruitless. All they found other than the victim's clothes and purse were a cigar butt, a half-empty bottle of whiskey. The autopsy showed that Fuller drank alcohol soon before her death, and some junk mail addressed to Mrs. C.B. Hawkins. The postcard Nora received from her murderer was never found. The inquest into her death was equally inconclusive. The most interesting testimony was offered by one of Fuller's friends, a Madge Graham. She startled everyone by declaring that Fuller had a secret boyfriend, a much older man named Bennett. She believed the newspaper ad Fuller answered was just a ruse to fool the girl's mother. Graham said that on one occasion, Nora had asked her to tell Mrs. Fuller that the two of them were going to the theater together, when in reality she was seeing Bennett. Corroboration of her claims was offered by a local grocer, who said that Fuller had often come into his store to phone someone at a hotel. Another friend of Fuller's recollected seeing her in a local park with a man who matched the descriptions given of C.B. Hawkins. Nora was stage-struck, and dreamed of becoming an actress. There were some suggestions that the mysterious Bennett had presented himself to the girl as someone who could help launch her theatrical career. No one at the time appeared to take Graham's story very seriously, which is surprising, because it would explain much about this peculiar case, most notably, Nora's otherwise inexplicable unconcern when she inevitably discovered that John Bennett's home address did not exist. The closest thing to a lead the police ever got in Fuller's murder came when it reached their attention that a bookkeeper named Charles B. Hadley had stolen money from his firm and disappeared. His girlfriend, Ollie Blazier, told investigators that his handwriting resembled a facsimile of the signature of C.B. Hawkins that had appeared in newspapers. Hadley and Blazier had clearly not parted on the best of terms. She went on to eagerly tell investigators, not to mention the press, that before he vanished, Hadley had intently read articles about Fuller's disappearance, which greatly disturbed him. She had found some garments of his that had blood on them. He was very partial to tenderloin, and, in short, she was convinced he was a murderer. The police became even more interested when they learned that Hadley was wanted for embezzlement in Minneapolis, under the name of Charles Start. Blazier's revelations, whether they were true or examples of a disgruntled ex-girlfriend seeking revenge, proved to be absolutely no help whatsoever. A hunt was made for Hadley, but the errant clerk had vanished, never to be found. Even if the authorities had tracked him down, it is very uncertain whether they would have found a murderer. As an aside, I doubt this was Bennett's first or last homicide. Fuller's death was so obviously, chillingly, pre-planned, with an almost ritualistic care, that I find myself wondering if the poor girl fell into the hands of some unknown early serial killer. Just some food for grim thought. In any case, the dreadful death of Nora Fuller remains one of San Francisco's most haunting mysteries. 2. The Halloween murder of Walter Schenk, 1902. Walter D. Schenk was a young teamster who had worked hard and saved his money to buy a home at 210 2nd Street in Adair, where he lived with his wife Ida and their 3 children. Schenk also served as an Adair city constable. Anticipating rowdy celebrants and pranksters on Halloween night of 1902, the city deployed Schenk and other constables to work extra time to prevent mischief and vandalism, what one newspaper referred to as depredations. When he left for patrol duty that Friday night after supper, Schenk had a small amount of money in his pocket and carried an umbrella. He was last seen about 9 p.m. making his rounds. Early the next morning, 26-year-old Schenk was found near his own front gate, shot in the head. Nearby was a revolver from which one cartridge was discharged. Rigor mortis had set in, indicating time of death at several hours before. Schenk's clothes were muddy and his cash missing. His umbrella was found 2 blocks away. The murder of Walter Schenk was perhaps all the more chilling because it happened on Halloween night 1902. Schenk was a hard-working man who lived with his wife, Ida, and their 3 young children in the small town of Adair, Iowa. He also served as a city constable, and it was this duty that led to his untimely death. As Halloween approached, Adair officials anticipated much mischief during the festivities. They decided to deploy their extra constables, including Schenk, to patrol the town during the evening. After eating with his family on Friday, October 31st, Schenk left his home to begin his patrol. His wife and children never saw him alive again. The following morning, his lifeless body was discovered near his own front gate with a single, fatal gunshot wound to the head. A discarded revolver was found nearby. A cartridge had been fired from it, so it was assumed to be the murder weapon. When Schenk was found, he appeared to have been dead for several hours. The motive seemed to be simple robbery because the cash that he had been carrying the previous evening was gone. Initial reports speculated that Schenk had taken his own life. However, the disheveled look of his person and the mud on his clothes seemed to suggest that a struggle had taken place and that someone else was responsible for his untimely death. No one was ever charged or even arrested in connection with the murder. Although investigators had found what they assumed to be the murder weapon, fingerprinting was not used as it is today. In fact, it wasn't until the following year, 1903, that the New York Police Department and Prison Service began to compile a database of fingerprints. In 1910, fingerprints were first used as solid evidence in a U.S. court in the Clarence Hiller murder case in Illinois. 3. The Clarkson Woods murder, 1921. On October 6, 1921, in the northeastern United States, the bloody murder of 12-year-old Janet Lawrence supplanted the World Series as the lead headline of the day. The Yankees, with an injured Babe Ruth, had won the first 2 games but would eventually fall to John McGraw's New York Giants. An international news service article described the murder of the Madison, New Jersey schoolgirl. A statewide alarm was sounded today for the maniacal slayer of little 12-year-old Janet Lawrence, whose body, pierced by 25 stab wounds, was found in Clarkson Woods, near here. She was found lying in a pool of blood. Her heart had been pierced and her throat slashed by the unknown slayer. After school hours, Janet frequently took a walk in the woods. In the jargon of the day, newspapers reported that the child had been criminally assaulted. Lieutenant W.J. Ryan of the Madison Police Department stated that in addition to the stab wounds, a handkerchief had been tightened around Janet's neck and her hands and feet were tied. The victim's face, neck, arms, and body had been slashed with what police believed was a pocket knife. Ryan informed the press that investigators believed a greenhouse worker was responsible for the murder because the rope used to tie the knots was the type of hemp used in tying rose bushes. It was indeed a heinous crime, but police seemed lost in their efforts to apprehend the killer. Having no real suspects, investigators took a shotgun approach and began arresting anyone who may have been close to the scene as well as those who had no connection to the case at all. First there was Francis Clarkson, 14, who admitted that he had been target shooting in the woods at the same time Janet was murdered. However, he stated that he'd been far away from where the girl's body was found and had heard nothing. There was no blood on his clothing, and no rope was found in his possession. He did have a Boy Scout pocket knife, but there was no blood on it. The county prosecutor quickly released the boy, citing a lack of evidence. In an unusual indictment of the police department, the jurist accused investigators of arresting Clarkson simply because he was the only person known to be in the area at the time. Police released a statement saying that they were looking for a wild, roughly dressed man seen near the site of the murder. Frank Felice fit the profile and was arrested. He was homeless, squatting in a hut near Glen Ridge, New Jersey. A neighbor told police that based on the description, he looked like the suspect. There was no other evidence against the wild man and he, too, was quickly released. A reward of $1,000 was offered by the Madison Town Council for the arrest and conviction of Janet Lawrence's killer. Frank Kruk, described as a ragged wanderer, was the next in line to be arrested. He'd been seen walking near Clarkson's woods and acting suspicious. He refused to speak to detectives, so in an effort to get him to talk, investigators took the vagabond to the scene of the crime. As he was led into the woods, Kruk fought against the cops. News reports stated that the officers tried to induce the man to look at the spot where Janet was murdered, but he struggled and turned his face away. He screamed for the police to kill him, and was lucky they didn't. He was eventually released for lack of evidence. On October 27, headlines sounded an alarm: there had been another crime against a child. United Press reported that the mysterious disappearance of Stella Ostrowski, 6 years old, Thursday, led to fresh reports about a New Jersey wild man who is suspected of carrying off children. Stella vanished during recess at the country school she attends near Fresh Pond last Tuesday. Her disappearance came at a time when the mysterious murder of little Janet Lawrence in Clarkson Woods near Madison, where she was hacked with a knife, was still unsolved, and where the people of Westwood were hunting a wild-looking man who attacked a young woman there and cut off her hair. Investigators believe all these crimes may have been committed by the same man. One man is in jail as a result of the epidemic of crimes against women and children. He is Louis Lively, Negro, accused of murdering a little girl at East Moorestown, N.J. But the latest hair clipping and the disappearance of Stella occurred after Lively was locked up. The Madison police arrested Frank Jankrak after a former co-worker told investigators that he'd confessed to the murder of Janet Lawrence. The former employee had been fired from his job at a greenhouse managed by Frank's brother and was likely seeking revenge. Even though there was no other corroboration of Jankrak's guilt, the case actually went to trial. He was acquitted. Members of the jury told reporters that there was no evidence against him except his co-worker's dubious claim that he'd confessed. 1 year after the murder, Madison police re-arrested Francis Clarkson. This time they weren't going to back down. The teenager's trial lasted a full week. Clarkson took the stand and gave the jury a minute-by-minute account of his whereabouts on the day Janet was killed. After a short deliberation, the young man was acquitted. Once again, jurors told reporters that the state had presented no evidence against Clarkson. Madison police had already convicted Clarkson in the media, and when he was found not guilty, the town exploded in anger. Investigators were furious and threatened to have him tried again. They were stymied only when the New Jersey Supreme Court ruled that a new trial would be unconstitutional. After his release, Clarkson was subjected to horrific abuse. In one instance, 4 men in a passing car fired several shots at him. He could go nowhere without his neighbors taunting him. The local police not only would not protect the teen, they added to his misery by continuing their media attacks on him. Clarkson's parents were poor, and his plight caught the attention of a millionaire banker named Monel Sayre. Originally from Madison, Sayre, a bachelor, had taken an interest in the case from the beginning. As he watched the boy's persecution, the kindly businessman felt the need to do something. He invited Clarkson to stay in his mansion for a few days. The bachelor and the beleaguered teen got along so well that those days turned into weeks, then months. Still, Clarkson's troubles didn't end. When Sayre took the teen to the Episcopal church that he attended near his home in Convent Station, they were both sent packing. Sayre was told that he could come back, but not with the killer. Townspeople threatened Clarkson so that he became a prisoner inside Sayre's mansion. Sayre, enraged, publicly declared that he would adopt the boy and leave his inheritance to him. He told the press, on account of 4 attempts to assassinate the boy within 2 weeks of his acquittal, I deemed it my Christian duty to take him to live with me. 2 years later, with the Janet Lawrence case still unsolved, another girl was murdered. Bricksboro High School student Emma Dixon, 15, was stabbed to death and hidden in a patch of woods near Port Elizabeth, New Jersey. A farmer who lived nearby was arrested after Emma's father told authorities that the man had invited her to take a ride with him. But he was quickly released and the case went unsolved for several months. Then, in a stunning sequence of events, her father, Thompson Dixon, was arrested. Tried for the murder of his own daughter, Dixon was acquitted. The Madison Police Department had attempted to railroad several innocent men for the murder of Janet Lawrence. Had either Francis Clarkson or Frank Janko been convicted, the case would have gone down in the books as having been solved. History would have been written differently, and, as it often is, it would have been wrong. Francis Clarkson was adopted by Monel Sayre. The old man was able to provide a luxurious, if lonely, life for the once poor farm boy. 4. The Camden Town Murder, 1907. At the turn of the 20th century, Camden Town, London was a rather unfashionable area of the growing city. Indeed, years before it became known for the arts and crafts of the present-day Camden markets, the small township was haunted by a far more sinister event, the unsolved murder of a young prostitute. On the evening of September 11, 1907, a part-time prostitute known by the name Phyllis Dimmock was murdered. Despite overwhelming evidence against her companion Robert Wood, above right, no culprit was ever brought to justice in the ruthless slaying of the 23-year-old woman. Dimmock's story began in 1884, in Hertfordshire village of Standon, where she was born as Emily Elizabeth Dimmock. Her family was poor and moved frequently. By the age of 17, Emily was working as a domestic servant in Street Neots. Later that same year, she went to live with her sister Maud, who found work for her as a servant in Finchley. From Finchley, Emily found her way to London, where she moved into a house owned by John William Crabtree. Crabtree was a small-time crook with prior convictions who was suspected of running a brothel. Likely, Emily was in her late teens when she began working as a prostitute near King's Cross, St. Pancras, and Euston stations. A few years after her arrival in London, however, Emily's life was markedly different. By 1906, just 1 year before her death, she was living in a common-law marriage with a young man named Bertram Birdshaw. As Bert was only 19 at the time, 3 years Emily's junior, he would have required his parents' permission to marry, and so the young couple lived together without the official mark of marriage. Right before Emily's murder, they had received the blessing of Bert's parents to marry. Emily was, by most accounts, a dutiful partner. However, while Bert was away working as an overnight chef for the Midway Railway, Emily returned to her former, more sordid trade. Every day, Bert left their home at approximately 4:15 p.m., arriving back at around 11:30 the following morning. With Bert gone, Emily stepped out into the night. On September 11, 1907, Emily, or Phyllis as she was known to her clients, was seen at Rising Sun, a public house in Euston Road, with a man named Robert Wood. Wood had met with her 5 days earlier, at which point he had written her a postcard that read, "Phyllis darling. If it pleases you to meet me at 8.15 at the Rising Sunday, yours to a cinder." It was signed Alice, for discretion. This small note would be key evidence in the ensuing investigation and trial. The following morning, Bert's mother stopped by to pay Emily a visit, arriving before Bert was off his shift. When Emily didn't answer the door, the landlady allowed her to stay and wait for Bert to return. Upon his arrival, the three of them unlocked the door and came upon a gruesome sight: Emily's lifeless body. Her throat was slit wide open, and the sheets were covered in her blood. Bert's razors were in the wash basin, and someone had evidently washed his own bloody hands there as well. The room had been rummaged through, though nothing much had been taken, except for a few postcards. In the ensuing days, the handwritten postcard, postmarked on September 9th, and found by Bert as he was moving from the room he had shared with Emily, was identified as having been authored by Wood. One of Wood's girlfriends recognized his handwriting in the newspaper-printed version of the card, and notified the authorities. Robert Wood, consequently, was accused of the murder of Emily Dimmock. It was assumed that he accompanied her home, slept with her, and then killed her in the early morning while she was still sleeping. Cleaning himself, he then exited the room, locking up as he left. In conjunction with this story, witnesses watched a man of Wood's description and particular gait, his right shoe jerked as he walked, while his left hand was pushed deep in his pocket, leave the neighborhood early on the morning of the September 12th. John William Crabtree, Emily's former landlord, also proved to be a good witness, identifying Wood as a frequent guest of Emily's while she lived in Crabtree's building. During the trial, Wood's attorney, the famous litigator Edward Marshall Hall, gave a stunning performance. He helped paint a story of Wood's innocence, including a shaky alibi that had Wood at his ill father's house by midnight on the night of the murder. He also argued that Wood's walk was not, in fact, remarkable. Ultimately, the lawyer's skill led to his client's quick acquittal. The jury reached their verdict within 15 minutes. This happened despite the relatively strong evidence of his guilt. The murder became the theme of many paintings and images, including Walter Sickert's 1908 painting, "What Shall We Do to Pay the Rent?" or, alternatively, The Camden Town Murder. The artist created several sketches and paintings under this same Camden Town murder style, all with a clothed man sitting or standing near a naked woman. While some say that perhaps Sickert's fascination with the murder and its victim indicates he was the killer, he did indeed live in the vicinity at the time, it is unlikely that this was the case, as there are no linkages that tie him to Emily, Bert, or any of their direct contacts. Though all evidence pointed to Wood, Emily's murder remains, technically, unsolved to this day. 5. Summerhouse murder of Caroline Luard, 1908. Caroline and Major General Charles Luard were upstanding members of their community in Kent, England. Then, tragedy struck, robbing them of the life they had built and enjoyed together. First, Caroline was found murdered at a neighbor's country home in Sealchart, Kent. Just weeks later, Charles took his own life. And though there's been much speculation, the case, widely known as the Sealchart murder, was never conclusively solved. Charles Luard was a former military man, a golfer, and a local politician who had founded the Patriotic Party. Caroline Luard was a well-liked friend, neighbor, and frequent volunteer for charitable causes. The parents of two grown sons, the couple was settling into the golden years of their life. Their social standing, as upper-class members of late Victorian society, made their untimely deaths particularly shocking and notable. The series of events began on August 24, 1908. A typical summer's day for 58-year-old Caroline and 69-year-old Charles. They left their home together, on foot. At 2:30 p.m. Charles was headed to the golf club to retrieve his clubs, while Caroline was planning to enjoy some exercise before returning to the house for afternoon tea with a friend. At 3 p.m., they parted ways at a particular gate. She headed through the gate and down a path that would take her through the woods, past their neighbor's mostly unused summer house, and back to their home. Charles traveled onward to the golf club. Little did the couple know it would be the last time they ever bid each other farewell. Various townspeople saw the Major General over the next 35 minutes as he made his way to the club. At around 4:05 p.m., after leaving the club, the local vicar, driving in the opposite direction, promised him a ride home after completing an errand. The relevant made good on this word, driving by again and picking Charles up at 4:20 p.m. and depositing him at his home at 4:25 p.m. Arriving at home, Charles was surprised to find Mrs. Stewart, the friend Caroline had promised to host for tea, waiting patiently for his wife's return. Upon realizing Caroline was missing, Charles set off in search of her at 4:30 p.m. 45 minutes later, his search ended when he found her lifeless body on the veranda of their neighbor's summer house. She had been shot in the back of the head, twice, and her purse and rings were missing. No cartridges could be found. In fact, there was no evidence of the killer at all, save for a few footprints. In the aftermath of Carolyn's murder, many strangers and self-proclaimed experts determined that Charles had killed his wife, despite his tight alibi. He could account for his whereabouts at 3:15 p.m., the estimated time of the murder based on the accounts of a neighbor and a gardener, both of whom heard 3 shots fired in the general direction of the summer house. Furthermore, the Major General offered up all 3 of the revolvers he owned to the authorities, and none matched the bullet holes found in Carolyn's skull. Still, rumors proclaiming Charles' guilt spread. Some believed that Caroline's missing rings had in fact been taken by Charles, to throw police off of his trail. Soon, Charles was receiving hate mail from people vehemently accusing him of his wife's murder. As the days progressed with no new evidence leading to any likely suspect, Charles' hope of finding Carolyn's killer dwindled. Devastated, and a pariah in his community, he put his home up for sale. A member of Parliament, Colonel Ward, offered Charles a place to stay. On September 17, as soon as the official inquest had ended, Colonel Ward collected the Major General and took him home. Additionally, the Luard son, stationed in South Africa, had finally gotten news of the family tragedy. He was en route to England to be with his father the following day. On the morning of September 18, the day his son was due to arrive, Charles Luard woke up, showered, and walked to the local train station. There, he hid in the bushes beside the track, then committed suicide by jumping in front of a passing train. The General Major met his tragic end less than a month after his wife met hers. Luard's suicide fanned the flames of the Seal Chart murder mystery. In the ensuing years, investigators came to believe the crime was committed by someone Carolyn knew, rather than by a random passerby. They thought her rings had been taken in an attempt to mislead the authorities to the true motive of the murder. In 1914, Sir Sidney Orme Rowan Hamilton, who went on to serve as Chief Justice of Bermuda in the 1930s, wrote a book about the unsolved murder that explored this line of thinking. He put forth the notion that Carolyn's killer was a man named John Dickman. Dickman was sentenced to death in 1910 for murdering a man on a train. Rowan Hamilton asserted that Dickman was connected to Carolyn Luard through an advertisement the former placed in the Times. He believed that Caroline responded to John Dickman's advertisement, asking for financial help, by sending him a check, which Dickman then forged, possibly by changing the amount. Upon discovering the forgery, Caroline contacted the man and arranged to meet with him, without telling her husband. So the theory goes, Dickman then murdered Carolyn at this meeting to cover his tracks. This is just a theory, however, and has never been conclusively proven. To this day, the Seal Chart murder case remains unsolved. 6. The Green Bicycle Murder, 1919. On a warm evening in July of 1919, the body of 21-year-old Bella Wright was found on a little-travelled road in Little Stretton, England, a small township near Leicester. Her bike was nearby, and there was a bullet wound in her head. She had last been seen by her uncle earlier that evening, with a man with a green bicycle. This man would later be identified as Ronald Light, a 34-year-old World War I veteran. Bella was a young woman of the working class, the first of 7 children of an illiterate farmhand and his wife. She went to school until she was 12, and then transitioned to working in order to help her family, first as a domestic servant, and then as a factory worker. She typically stayed close, riding her bicycle the 5 miles between work and home. On the night of her murder, the young woman had been traveling to see her uncle, George Measure, when her front bicycle tire came loose. A passing stranger, now known to be Light, stopped to help her and, when he did not have the necessary tools for the job, offered to accompany her on her way. They arrived together at Measure's house. The uncle would later describe Light as unnerving. But, once the bike was fixed, his niece and the seemingly helpful stranger rode off together. The time was approximately 8:50 p.m. Just half an hour later, at 9:20 p.m., local farmer named Joseph Cowell happened upon Bella's overturned bike, and her motionless body, on the quiet country lane. He immediately called for help, summoning both the local doctor and police constable Alfred Hall. It was, of course, too late for the doctor's services, and his candle-lit autopsy of the body pronounced her dead from a bicycle accident. Police Constable Hall, however, wasn't so sure. In the morning, he returned to the nearby church, where Bella's body had been moved, to more closely examine the results of her accident. Wiping blood and matted hair away from her face, he saw the clear mark of a bullet wound and knew, suddenly, that her death had been a murder. A trip back to the site where her body was found revealed a .45 caliber bullet, confirming his suspicions. The story quickly spread, as did George Measure's description of the mysterious man and his bicycle with unusually shaped handlebars. A poster was made, and all were told to be on the lookout for either the described man or, notably, his green bicycle. It wasn't until February of the following year that any progress was made on the matter. It was at this point that, in a serendipitous accident, the tow rope of a coal barge snagged an important piece of debris from the bottom of the river Soar. It was the frame of the green bicycle. The remaining bits were hauled up as well, and investigators were able to identify the bicycle, despite it being dismantled, with many of the serial numbers shaved off, as belonging to one Ronald Light. Later, a laborer by the name of Samuel Holland would come forward, stating that he saw Light dismantle the bike and toss it into the river, piece by piece, from the Upperton Road Bridge in Leicester. Also pulled from the same river? An Army-issued pistol holster, and .45 caliber bullets, matching the bullet at the scene of the crime. Light was arrested on March 4, 1920. He claimed he was innocent of Bella's murder. He admitted he had been with her on the night of her death, but that he had split ways with her upon leaving her uncle's home. He cited his ailing mother as the reason that he had not come forward as being the man with the green bicycle, and for having attempted to dispose of that evidence. He even admitted to being the owner of the found holster, as well as having owned a revolver. In short, he admitted to everything, except for the actual murder. At his trial that summer, Light appeared to be quite the gentleman. The facts presented against him, however, painted a different story. Along with all of the evidence to which he had admitted, it was found that Light had also had several incidences in the past, including run-ins with the law. He had been fired from a number of positions, had a seemingly unhealthy fascination with fire, having attempted to light offices and a row of haystacks, and had been accused of inappropriate conduct towards girls and young women over a number of years and in a variety of settings. In every incident, no charges were brought against Light. Despite this damning information, Light's strategic lawyer, Sir Edward Marshall Hall, who, coincidentally, would earn the nickname the Great Defender from his successful representation of people accused of horrendous murders, presented his client as a trustworthy teacher, army man, and community member. He also offered the court a story which excluded Light from having any murderous motive. The young woman, so Sir Edward suggested, had likely been shot accidentally from at a great distance, not close range as Light was accused. It seemed like an obvious conviction, but Light's professional and calm demeanor, combined with the theory that a close-range shot would have more grotesquely disfigured the victim's face, provided the jury with enough reason to acquit the man. Light walked free, and Bella's family and community were left wondering what happened during the last half hour of her life. Almost 100 years later, the case remains unsolved. After his acquittal, Light moved away, changed his name, and married. He lived a quiet life, dying in 1975 at the age of 89. 7. The Locked Room Murder of Joe Elwell, 1920. It was a very narrow window of time to commit a murder. Joseph Brown Elwell was a New York City resident and an expert of the game of bridge. He had written several books on the subject and was well known in the card-playing community. He also had the reputation of being quite a ladies' man. His private address book contained the names and contact information of more than 50 women. some of whom were married. He might have made a few enemies in his pursuit of the fairer sex, such as husbands and boyfriends of his conquests. The morning of June 11, 1920, went according to routine. Mail was delivered to J.B. Elwell's house at 7:10 in the morning. Elwell's housekeeper arrived 1 hour later and, upon entering, discovered her employer sitting in a chair in the living room. When he did not respond to her greeting, she became suspicious. He was always a cordial man. Entering into the room, she saw he had an open letter on his lap and there was unopened mail on the floor beside him. He also had a bullet hole in the middle of his forehead. Calling for help, the housekeeper waited anxiously for the police and an ambulance to arrive. The authorities arrived and discovered that J.B. Elwell was alive but unresponsive. They rushed him to the hospital where he died soon after. The police were baffled by the crime scene. There was no gun found, but the bullet that killed him was found neatly placed on a table in the room. It might have ricocheted off a wall and onto the table, but the placement of the bullet looked staged. The bullet's cartridge was found lying on the floor. The angle of the wound indicated that the killer had been crouched in front of Elwell when the trigger was pulled. There were no foreign fingerprints found at the scene and there was no sign of a struggle or forced entry into the house. Nothing was stolen. Elwell most likely knew his killer and freely let him or her into the house. But why would he invite a visitor into his home and then proceed to sit down and ignore them while opening his mail? Or did they chat amiably while he went about this mundane task? The letter in his lap and the mail on the floor offered no clue as to the crime. The authorities would investigate but ran into a series of dead ends. The crime has never been solved. The media went rabid with speculation regarding the puzzling crime. The New York Times theorized that Elwell was not the mild-mannered bridge expert that he presented to the world, but had a dark side and that the solution to the murder could only be found in Elwell's Jekyll and Hyde personality. In a bizarre twist, the following April a man confessed to the crime but quickly repudiated that confession, saying he only admitted to the crime so that he would get the death penalty and cause no more trouble to his wife and family. He was not prosecuted. 8. The Hall Mills Murder, 1922. Though it's largely forgotten now, the bizarre mystery of the Hall Mills murder of 1922 was once the most publicized criminal investigation in the country. The sensational qualities of the case, coupled with its cast of made-for-the-tabloids characters, positioned the Slanes at the center of a major American media of the early 20th century. It began with two young lovers out for a morning stroll in the New Jersey countryside, who soon stumbled upon a grisly discovery: the body of a man and woman, shot dead in a field. The victims were carefully posed after death, their feet pointed toward a crab-apple tree, his hand placed on her neck, hers on his thigh. Both had been shot in the head with the .32 caliber pistol, the man once, the woman 3 times. Around them were scattered shreds of love letters, and his calling card at his feet. The man was Reverend Edward Wheeler Hall, an Episcopal priest in New Brunswick. The woman was Eleanor Reinhardt Mills, a singer in the choir at his church with whom he had been having an affair. Both were married to other people. The Reverend's wife was Frances Noel Stevens Hall, a wealthy older woman whom many in the community believed the Reverend had married for money. Eleanor's spouse was James Mills, a sexton at the church and a janitor at a nearby elementary school. The love affair was an open secret in the town. When news of the death spread, curious citizens flocked to the crime scene. Souvenir hunters crowded the area, contaminating evidence and even passing around the calling card that was left at Edward Hall's feet. Adding to the fire was the odd and grisly state of the victims' bodies. Besides being shot in the head 3 times, Eleanor Mills' throat had been cut, and a later autopsy revealed that her tongue and larynx had also been cut out. Though Edward Hall still wore his glasses and a Panama hat covered his face, his watch was missing. Authorities declared jealousy the motive, and suspicion soon fell upon Edward Hall's wife and her 2 brothers. Mrs. Hall, above, was related to one of the wealthiest and most prominent families in New Brunswick, fueling the flames of the media frenzy when she was brought to trial in November of 1926. Newspapers like the New York Times and the New York Daily Mirror devoted inches of column space to the proceedings. The papers even gave nicknames to many of the key players in the crime, referring to Eleanor Mills as the glamour girl of the choir, while the chief witness of the prosecution was a woman who lived nearby and raised hogs, dubbed the Pig Lady. The murder trial lasted 30 days. While Mrs. Hall and her brothers had both motive and means, they were ultimately acquitted of the murders, due largely to a lack of adequate evidence, an issue exacerbated, no doubt, by the contaminated crime scene. After her acquittal, Mrs. Hall brought a defamation suit against the New York Daily Mirror for their coverage. While most historians now believe that Mrs. Hall and her two brothers were the guilty parties, the case has officially never been solved. That doesn't mean that it hasn't been resurrected time and time again in media and even in the movies. Acclaimed authors Damon Runyon and Mary Roberts Reinhardt were among the journalists who reported on the trial, and it found its way into both fiction and non-fiction accounts throughout the years. It has even been suggested that the Hall Mills murder case was the inspiration for a part of The Great Gatsby, which was published just a few years after the murders. 9. The murder of Willie Starch-Filled, 1914. On January 8, 1914, an errand boy was sent to deliver a parcel. On his way back to work, he boarded a train at Mildmay Park Station on the North London Railway. The lad entered a third-class compartment. As the train approached Dalston Station, he suddenly noticed a small hand protruding from under the seat. Frightened, the boy tried without success to attract the attention of a porter. When the train arrived at Haggerston, the boy bolted from the station and out into the street. He recovered himself and went to the station master's office to report what he had seen. The train was stopped and searched. Beneath the seat in the compartment the lad had traveled in was the body of a 5 or 6-year-old boy with long golden curls. The face was suffused with blood, the lips were bruised, and marks on the neck suggested that a cord of some kind had been used. Chief Inspector William Goff took the case up and initiated inquiries on the assumption that the boy had been strangled. His opinion was soon confirmed by Dr. Spilsbury, who examined the body. It did not take long to identify the child. He was the son of John and Agnes Starch-Filled. John Starch-Filled sold newspapers. In 1912, he had enjoyed some notoriety after he tackled an armed Armenian named Stephen Titus, who entered the Horseshoe Hotel and shot a man and woman. Starch-Filled was separated from his wife. Willie, their little boy, lived with his mother, and about 12:50 p.m., on the day of the murder, she sent him out on an errand. He never returned. According to the medical evidence, the murder took place sometime between 2 p.m. and 3 p.m., and the train had shuttled several times between Chalk Farm and Broad Street after the murder had been committed. The inquest opened on January 15, 1914, and evidence was given by the guard of the train, the errand boy who discovered the body, and the porter who first searched the train. John Starch-Filled was asked to account for his movements on the day of the murder. He said he was in his bed in a lodging house and he had not seen the boy for 3 weeks. The inquest was adjourned. When the inquest was resumed a week later, 2 signalmen gave evidence relating to a piece of cord they had found on the line on the day of the murder. Dr. Spilsbury said that it could have been responsible for the marks on the child's throat. A third signalman testified that when he was on duty at the St. Pancras box as the 2:14 p.m. train from Chalk Farm passed, he saw a man in a compartment bending over what he thought was a young girl. This signalman examined the body of the murdered boy and said that he recognized the face as the one he had seen. The long curls had misled him as to the sex. Another witness was the driver of a shunting engine in Camden coal yard. He stated that between 2:30 p.m. and 3 p.m., he had seen a man stooping over something in a compartment and that the man appeared to be tying up a parcel. The most important witness was Clara Wood. She said she had seen a man leading a little boy by the hand on the afternoon of the murder. The boy was eating a piece of currant cake. The post-mortem had disclosed 1½ ounces of partially digested food which contained currants. Wood was asked if she could identify the man. She pointed to John Starch-Filled. "Me?" said Starch-Filled. "Yes," said Wood. "It's a lie," shouted Starch-Filled. The coroner adjourned the inquest at that stage and remarked that further inquiries would be made in Starch-Filled's interest. When the inquest was resumed, witnesses from the lodging house gave evidence on behalf of Starch-Filled. A commercial traveler named John White was called. He described how he had seen a man and boy together at Camden Town Station. He identified Starch-Filled as the man. "It's a lie," shouted Starch-Filled. "A damned lie." One of the lodging house witnesses said, "It is too. He was in bed at the time." The jury returned a verdict of willful murder against Starch-Filled. He was taken into custody and taken to Old Street Police Station. While he was awaiting trial, one of the essential witnesses attempted to commit suicide, and the prosecution suffered a further setback when Wood failed to stand up to cross-examination. She created the impression that she had seen a photograph of Starch-Filled in a newspaper before she had identified him. She was confused about the hat he was wearing when she saw him. She admitted that when shown a photograph of the boy she could not identify him as the boy she had seen. The judge was critical of the coroner's office after the coroner had read to the jury statements made to the police without formal depositions or questioning the witnesses. The judge said, "I find that the depositions were not taken down at the time by the coroner, or at any rate they were not read over to the witnesses." Then, apparently, the coroner's officer who took them round to be signed was permitted to allow the witnesses to correct them. That procedure seems to me to be an entire mockery and an abuse of the duties entrusted to any coroner. The judge instructed the jury to return a formal verdict of not guilty. Starch-Filled died in the St. Pancras Infirmary in 1916. He always protested his innocence and used to say that some friend of Stephen Titus killed his son in an act of revenge.